Hello, everyone, and welcome to Eternalism in a Nutshell. My name is David, and the title of this episode is If Only I Had Known Then in 2004 What I Know Now in 2023, Part 3. This is Episode 3. One of my goals in these opening episodes is to put everyone on notice that cultural Marxism and woke activism advances a radical left agenda and belief system that is both ideologically and religiously driven, and whose aim is to fundamentally transform Western civilization by promoting socialist ideals while undermining traditional values and beliefs. Its goal, then, is to create as much moral chaos and cultural madness as possible in order to achieve these radical changes. Consider, for example, the moral chaos and cultural madness of an adult male claiming to be non-binary and gender fluid, or the moral chaos and cultural madness of a bearded man with a clownish red wig and outlandish makeup declaring himself to be a woman, while performing before a group of little children in what is called the Drag Queen Story Hour. Now you might be thinking that what you are witnessing is simply the blurring of gender norms. But that is not so, as is evidenced by the latest childish and irrational madness of furries, wherein an adult male or female self-identifies as a furry animal, such as a furry fox with an adult male or female furry fox boyfriend. Obviously, this is far more than an attack on morality and the family, for it is an all-out attack on the law of identity and sanity itself. After all, if these woke activists can bully us into calling a man a woman or a woman a man when we all know fully well that this is not so, or if they can persuade us that it is normal and rational for an adult to take on the childish and absurd role of a furry fox, then it shouldn't surprise any of us that the next step will be to convince us or bully us into accepting the nonsensical and farcical notion that 2 + 2 = 5. What's at stake, then, is not merely traditional norms and family values, but our very identity and sanity as moral and rational beings. And yet, it is precisely this irrationality, moral chaos, and cultural madness that these cultural Marxists and woke activists are aiming at and counting on in the takedown of Western civilization. So with all that having been said, let's take an additional look at this cultural Marxism and woke activism that is currently threatening our sanity and Western way of life. Now at this point, we have learned that cultural Marxism advances a radical left agenda and belief system driven by ideology and religion. It operates within the framework of Marxist social conflict theory and aims to agitate for social, economic, and political change through a nasty, relentless, and revolutionary approach. Nonetheless, cultural Marxism represents a revolution from within and requires what Gramsci's followers referred to as the long march through the institutions. Its praxis is to create as much moral chaos and cultural confusion as possible, with the goal of transforming Western society by promoting socialist ideals under the guise of social justice, while undermining traditional values, social norms, and religious beliefs. Now, it's important to realize that all these woke activists are also woke allies, united in a common cultural revolution, and their various causes are just different manifestations of cultural Marxism in action. After all, the praxis of cultural Marxism is being carried out by these agitators, also known as change agents, who can be found supporting movements like race Marxism, queer Marxism, climate Marxism, and vegan Marxism, among others. Race Marxism aims to abolish what it perceives as systemic racism, or white privilege, by eliminating the power and privilege associated with this whiteness. Thus, anti-racism today is seen as anti-whiteness. Queer Marxism, on the other hand, aims to abolish traditional gender norms associated with heterosexuality, including the nuclear family, with its emphasis on the heterosexual union of male and female within marriage. The LGBTQ+ community, legalizing same-sex marriages, and recognizing transgender rights are all part of this cultural Marxism and woke activism. Next, what we have what could be called climate Marxism, whose stated goal is to abolish all climate deniers. This includes silencing, canceling out, and abolishing any scientist's scientific data which disagrees with their climate change agenda and narrative of saving the planet by a massive depopulation of humans or carbon footprints, and the redistribution of resources. Finally, let's consider what one might rightly refer to as vegan Marxism, whose stated goal is to abolish all meat eating by prohibiting the eating of meat altogether and substituting a diet of bugs and insects for protein instead. Again, as far as cultural Marxism is concerned, it doesn't really matter what social grievance you have as long as you have one. For according to the Marxist social conflict theory, there must be a series of perpetual grievances to incite perpetual revolutions until the end of history. After all, Marx himself stated that the task was not just to understand the world, but to change it, and by that he meant all of it. And this wholesale change requires these various woke activists and woke allies to take up a variety of social causes and work together as though united in one common cause, and together pound away endlessly at the social, cultural, religious, and political underpinnings of Western civilization, and do so until the end of history, which end of history is simply code for until the Marxist revolution is complete, and these cultural Marxists and radical leftists are in full control of all aspects of society, a totalitarian regime. Which brings us to a very dark and disturbing ending to this cultural revolution from within, and to these woke activists and woke allies who believed that they were advocating for social justice and saving the planet, when in reality they were doing no such thing. For when this Marxist cultural revolution is complete, these woke activists and woke allies will no longer be needed or tolerated. And if history is any guide, these instigators of social change will be the very first to be rounded up and eliminated. After all, in this Marxist utopia or totalitarian regime run by Marxists and radical leftists, the last thing they will want running around or posting on Twitter are individuals with perpetual grievances inciting perpetual revolutions. At this point, then, anti-racism, gender identity, climate change, eating meat, and any other social grievance, such as same-sex marriages or transgender rights, will be swept aside by these totalitarian Marxists as so much gibberish, rubbish, and culture madness from the past. In the meantime, however, and in the year 2023, we find this cultural Marxism advancing its long march through the institutions of Western civilization, along with these various woke activists and woke allies working tirelessly to do the bidding of these Marxist and radical leftists. and all under the guise of social justice and saving the planet. What we are witnessing, then, is not the betterment of humanity or the saving of the planet, but the multitask takedown of Western civilization. And sadly, when it comes to cultural Marxism, these various social causes can be seen as different military branches of its armed forces, with, for example, race Marxism as the Army, queer Marxism as the Navy, climate Marxism as the Air Force, vegan Marxism as the Marines, and so on. Most woke activists may not even be aware of cultural Marxism, but whether knowingly or not, they serve as an army of cultural Marxists and contribute to the takedown of Western civilization by advancing the current moral and cultural madness of our day. Else why call them social justice warriors? Now, as an example of advancing the moral chaos and cultural madness of our day, let's take a moment to focus on just one of the four military or activist branches of cultural Marxism listed here, queer Marxism, and its existential threat to our traditional way of life as Americans and to our sacred and religious beliefs as Latter-day Saints, pertaining to the nuclear family, temple ordinances, and work for the dead. The threat that queer Marxism ideology presents to traditional values and Latter-day Saint beliefs can be seen in innumerable ways. But I have chosen to focus on two specific examples. The first of which is how the presence of transgender women in women's sports poses an existential threat to all women's sports. This raises concerns about gender-specific facilities, such as locker rooms and showers, and competitions among female athletes in various tournaments and championships. Now, prohibiting transgender women from competing with female athletes is not about fairness. This is about preserving our adult status as rational and sane human beings. Nonetheless, the cultural Marxists press on, willing to sacrifice all of women's sports to their insane cause and misunderstanding of social justice, as well as to rely on legal pressure from woke judges and anti-discrimination laws, all of which social and legal pressure is a form of bullying, for this is not social justice but social mayhem. And figuratively speaking, one might as well throw a bomb with a lit fuse into the mix, for this so-called social advancement and farce will bring an end to all women's sports of an athletic nature. Hence, queer Marxism poses an existential threat to women's sports. Now let's apply this same queer Marxism to the Lord's house, meaning our Latter-day Saint temples, sacred ordinances, and beliefs pertaining to temple marriage and work for the dead. For queer Marxism, with its gender-neutral advocacy, poses an existential threat to temple worship and its gender-specific accommodations, ordinances, marriages, and work for the dead. To understand the existential nature of this threat, consider permitting a transgender woman and member of the church to not only enter the temple worthily, but to perform vicarious work for the dead. This would mean that a transgender woman, who is really a man, would be doing vicarious work for female spirits in the spirit world, all of which is being promoted by the bullying of these cultural Marxists and woke activists under the guise of social justice and under the cover of anti-discrimination laws. This imagined scenario, of course, is not temple worship, but temple mayhem. Hence, queer Marxism poses an existential threat to the Lord's house and to all that it represents. I bring the temple into our discussion not only because queer Marxism is an existential threat to the church, temple worship, the plan of salvation, and the nuclear family, but because a good number of these woke activists are either active members of the church or post-Mormons who have left the church for one reason or another. And while it may seem like the paramount crisis facing the church today is all the gender identity issues associated with the LGBTQ plus community, this is really not the case at all. For what I am trying to alert everyone to is the much larger picture and danger that is associated with cultural Marxism itself, along with its numerous activist branches, and whether these be race Marxism, queer Marxism, climate Marxism, vegan Marxism, and so on, doesn't really matter, for they are all operating within the theoretical framework of Marx's social conflict theory. And the aim is not just to take down the church, its temples, and the nuclear family, but all of Western civilization. It just so happens that the church is currently taking the brunt of the assault from the woke activist branch of cultural Marxism called queer Marxism. Again, it's truly doubtful that these active members of the church and post-Mormons who are protesting as woke activists and woke allies are even aware of cultural Marxism, or that they are caught up in a much bigger and far more serious and historic game than they think. Nonetheless, these active church members and post-Mormons are well aware of the fact that if they are going to get access to our temples with their gender-neutral and woke agenda, they must first go through the family proclamation to the world. In effect, and for our unique time, this family proclamation to the world is the canary in the coal mine. For as the family proclamation goes, so goes access to the temple. And these woke activists know that. And so they are desperately trying to denounce, abolish, or otherwise alter this family proclamation to make it inclusive of the LGBTQ plus community. This, of course, would sound the death knell of the canary in the coal mine, and would send the entire church membership of faithful Latter-day Saints into an existential crisis from which it is very doubtful they would ever recover. Nonetheless, and though we Latter-day Saints may think this gender identity battle over the family proclamation to the world is the be-all and end-all of the current crisis, we should be forewarned that it is not, for I have already mentioned that things are not going to end well for all these woke activists and woke allies within and without the church who think they are advancing the course of social justice and saving the planet. But I have one other dire warning as well, which, interesting enough, is part of the family proclamation itself, which reads, "We warn that the disintegration of the family will bring upon individuals, communities, and nations the calamities foretold by ancient and modern prophets." It appears then that as far as the Lord is concerned, the disintegration of the family is also the canary in the coal mine for the coming judgments and the end of the world. Now, normally I would end this episode here, but for those who may doubt the seriousness or validity of what I have presented in these past few episodes, perhaps hearing it from a former KGB agent who defected from the Soviet Union in 1970 might be more convincing. For he speaks of the 4 stages of the Soviet subversion model, and which subversion of America and the West had by 1984, according to the KGB, already surpassed their wildest imaginations. In any case, the 4 stages he speaks of are demoralization, destabilization, crisis, and normalization. Which subversion model lines up with the long march through the institutions that these cultural Marxists and woke activists have been engaged in for these many years. And since Professor Steve Turley does a masterful job explaining the relationship between this Soviet four-stage subversion plan and this cultural Marxism and woke activism, I will step aside and let him do the presenting.
What you're about to see is an interview from the year, ironically, 1984. It involves KGB defector Yuri Bezmenov and his revelation of what he called the Soviet subversion model, a four-point plan by which the Soviet Union sought to subvert the United States from within. I think I can assure you that you're going to find what he says chilling in how it seems to be playing out right before our very eyes.
Mr. Bezmenov was born in 1939 in a suburb of Moscow. He was the son of a high-ranking Soviet Army officer. He was educated in the elite schools inside the Soviet Union and became an expert in Indian culture and Indian languages. He had an outstanding career with Novosti, which was the, and still is, I should say, the press arm or the press agency of the Soviet Union. It turns out that this is also a front for the KGB. He escaped to the West in 1970 after becoming totally disgusted with the Soviet system, and he did this at great risk to his life. He certainly is one of the world's outstanding experts on the subject of Soviet propaganda and disinformation and active measures. Well, you spoke several times before about ideological subversion. That is a phrase that I'm afraid some Americans don't fully understand. When the Soviets use the phrase ideological subversion, what do they mean by it?
Ideological subversion is the slow process which we call either ideological subversion or active measures, активные мероприятия in the language of the KGB, or psychological warfare. What it basically means is to change the perception of reality of every American to such an extent that despite of the abundance of information, no one is able to come to sensible conclusions in the interests of defending themselves, their families, their community, and their country.
All right, I just want to make sure we have that definition really set in front of us here as he takes us through the process. Big picture, Bezmenov is making the point that much of the work at the KGB had literally nothing to do with the James Bond-like glamours of espionage and intrigue. Instead, much of it involved a very slow, very patient, but very deliberate process of undermining the stability of a rival nation through what they called ideological subversion. And here's how he defined that. Quote, what it basically means is to change the perception of reality of every American to such an extent that despite the abundance of information, no one is able to come to sensible conclusions in the interest of defending themselves, their families, their community, and their country. I gotta say, when I first heard that, some time back, I asked myself, is he defining or is he describing? Because what he just said there could easily be a description of many in our society today. We have an entire class of people whose perception of reality is quite literally beyond the sensible, beyond the biological, beyond the national. They're increasingly pushing a vision of reality that seemingly makes no sense, even to people on the left like Bill Maher. And yet everyone's scared to death to confront them on it, to stand up to this, lest you be excommunicated, canceled.
It's a great brainwashing process which goes very slow, and it's divided in four basic stages. The first one being demoralization. It takes from 15 to 20 years to demoralize a nation. Why that many years? Because this is the minimum number of years which requires to educate one generation of students in the country of your enemy, exposed to the ideology of the enemy. In other words, Marxism-Leninism ideology is being pumped into the soft heads of at least 3 generations of American students without being challenged or counterbalanced by the basic values of Americanism, American patriotism. The demoralization process in the United States is basically completed already. For the last 25 years, actually it's overfulfilled, because demoralization now reaches such areas where previously not even Comrade Andropov and all his experts would even dream of such a tremendous success. Most of it is done by Americans to Americans, thanks to lack of moral standards. As I mentioned before, exposure to true information does not matter anymore. A person who was demoralized is unable to assess true information. The facts tell nothing to him. Even if I shower him with information, with authentic proof, with documents, with pictures, even if I take him by force to the Soviet Union and show him concentration camp, he will refuse to believe it until he is going to receive a kick in his fat bottom. When a military boot crashes his balls, then he will understand, but not before that. That's the tragic of the situation of demoralization.
When he talked about this first stage of demoralization, I could not help but think of the Frankfurt School, which was a group of European academics who came over to the United States to escape Hitler, but brought their cultural Marxist ideas to the American university. And for various reasons, the ideas flourished in colleges across the nation. And at the heart of the Frankfurt School's ideology is this notion of critical theory, which teaches students how to supposedly expose everything in our culture, from our politics to our economics, from our entertainment to our fashion, you name it, as inherently racist, sexist, and homophobic. And eventually critical theory entered into our K-12 classrooms through the broader notion of what's called critical pedagogy, from which we get what's called CRT, or critical race theory. But what Bezmenov is saying here is that all of that was highly deliberate. It wasn't simply an academic development in the free exchange of ideas. It was more like a virus that was deliberately injected into our national culture and radically weakened our social immune system. And as he put it, it was more effective than any KGB agent could have imagined. And he would go on to say that that's going to take a new generation of Americans to rise up and push back against this neo-Marxist ideological filth that's so permeated the last couple of generations.
The next stage is destabilization. This time, subverter does not care about your ideas and the patterns of your consumption. Whether you eat junk food and get fat and flabby, doesn't matter anymore. This time, and it takes only from 2 to 5 years to destabilize a nation, what matters is essentials: economy, foreign relations, defense systems. And you can see it quite clearly that in some areas, in such sensitive areas as defense and economy, the influence of Marxist-Leninist ideas in the United States is absolutely fantastic. I could never believe it 14 years ago when I landed in this part of the world, that the process will go that fast.
Well, it's only gone downhill from there. Woke cancel culture has completely infected our mainstream economy and, unfortunately, our military.
And I personally find it offensive that we are accusing the United States military, our general officers, our commissioned, non-commissioned officers, of being, quote, woke or something else because we're studying some theories that are out there. That was started at Harvard Law School years ago, and it proposed that there were laws in the United States, antebellum laws prior to the Civil War, that led to a power differential with African Americans that were 3/4 of a human being when this country was formed. And then we had a Civil War and Emancipation Proclamation to change it. And we brought it up to the Civil Rights Act in 1964. It took another 100 years to change that. So look I do want to know.
Yeah, that's Woke Milley. General Mark Milley, chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, defending, teaching cultural Marxism to our officers.
The next stage, of course, is crisis. It may take only up to 6 weeks to bring a country to the verge of crisis. You can see it in Central America now. And after crisis, with a violent change of power, structure, and economy, you have so-called the period of normalization. It may last indefinitely. Normalization is a cynical expression borrowed from Soviet propaganda. When the Soviet tanks moved into Czechoslovakia in '68, Comrade Brezhnev said, "Now the situation in brotherly Czechoslovakia is normalized." This is what will happen in the United States if you allow all these schmucks to bring the country to crisis, to promise people all kind of goodies and the paradise on earth, to destabilize your economy, to eliminate the principle of free market competition, and to put a big brother government in Washington, D.C., with benevolent dictators like Walter Mondale, who will promise lots of things, never mind whether the promises are fulfillable or not.
Yeah, again, as I hear him describe this crisis stage, I just couldn't help but think of where we are today with the bumbling Biden administration. I mean, unprecedented inflation, surging gas prices, a looming recession, baby formula shortages, supply chain interruptions. I need another hand. Border implosion, a violent crime epidemic, defunding the police, woke school boards, global pandemics, mass lockdowns, unconstitutional vax mandates. And then after that, normalization. This crisis condition ends up being the new normal. A fully destabilized nation is now the new normal, and the enemy has been thwarted from within. I mean, it's pretty terrifying stuff. But again, the good news is that Bezmenov believed that we were just one generation away from American renewal. And everywhere we look, that's exactly what we're seeing. There is nothing short of a massive grassroots backlash against woke cultural Marxism, and it's just the beginning. We will take our nation back, and we will go through a conservative renaissance. And we'll have people like Yuri Bezmenov to thank.
Let's stop here and pick up this story in the next episode, for there is still much to be considered. Thank you for watching. Push the like button if you enjoyed this episode, and be sure to push the subscribe button. Until next time, consider the gravity of these perilous times, and remember that our children and grandchildren are depending on us to get this right and to leave them a world wherein they at least have a fighting chance.